Well, good morning, afternoon, evening, living streams. How you guys doing? I'm really excited to be here with Dan Riccio again this week. It's been nice having you as a more of a frequent flyer on the podcast. Dan, for those of you who don't know, is one of our elders. Yeah, and a really valuable part of our content team on the back end or the front end, giving insights to whoever's preaching on a pretty regular basis. And today we're going to be digging in a little bit deeper. Yesterday I preached on Jude, and we had a little sermonette after quite a bit of context for the Book of Jude. And I was hoping we could maybe start off diving right into the nerdiest bit of the context in the Book of Jude. I made a promise yesterday that we would spend some time unpacking these weird references that he makes to non-biblical things. But before we do that, Dan, how's your day going?
It's been eventful. Bit of work, bit of trying to get here, car out of gas and things like that, but nothing that can't be fixed by a bike ride and a tank of gas, a little tank of gas. But so. You
got any plans for Halloween coming up this week?
No, I have nothing planned. It's a Thursday night, right?
Yeah,
so.
Me neither. I'm hoping the countertops for my kitchen will come in. They're like 2 weeks late, and I was told that they might come in on Halloween, which would be exciting.
If anyone wants a really good watching the true meaning of Halloween, there's a guy named Ryan Reeves that's a professor at Gordon Conwell, and he has a Halloween video. And it's not engaging in should you do Halloween or not do Halloween. It just goes, look at how many layers there are to this tradition, and how it's pretty unique, and not like you can just go, oh, this is what it was. There's a whole bunch of stuff leading up to what it is. So
I'm in a new neighborhood. The neighborhood we've been in the last couple of years was a little gated community, and suffice it to say, we got to eat all of the candy we bought. It had 0 visitors, I think. But this neighborhood, I'm expecting it's going to be nuts.
Yeah.
Because on random days of the week, you drive around and you'll see like 2 or 3 kids' birthday parties with inflatables out, and I love it. It's like just randomly, like out of nowhere, everybody's like having a birthday on this particular. I actually thought to myself, this would be a great neighborhood to like buy an inflatable and then just rent it out for cheaper than the companies to the neighbors and pass it around. You'd probably get back your money for that inflatable in like 5 minutes in my neighborhood. So
that's the opposite of being the person giving out apple slices or something healthy on Halloween. Yeah.
So I'm expecting, as I'm thinking that, we should probably go buy some candy. I'm expecting a pretty crazy, pretty busy doorbell this year.
It does end up being a nice time to get to know your neighbors. So if you haven't gotten to know your neighbors, we've found it's a good way to get to know your neighborhood a little more.
Yep, there you go. And I'm pretty sure Silas is going to be a truck.
Ah, nice.
He's obsessed with everything is tractor right now. All the trucks and everything.
Very cool.
He loves them. But he's gonna be really happy about that. He actually, the other night, he was falling asleep and he was in his tractor pajamas and he was like nodding off and had been out for maybe like 30 seconds to a minute. And he just sat up and went, tractor, and laid back
That's
down.
Cool.
So he's looking forward to it. Well, Dan, you were actually the one I started picking your brain on this weird Book of Enoch reference and stuff like that in the Book of Jude as we were prepping for it. Because I felt like even though that might not be someplace that we're going to spend a lot of time on in our sermon series, when you read Jude, it's a short book. And it makes, I think, 2 references to the Book of Enoch, one of which is almost a word-for-word quote, and then a reference to probably the Testament of Moses or the extension of Moses, neither of which are in the Bible, neither of which are even technically usually considered apocryphal, right? I don't think either of them have ever been considered.
The pseudepigraphal, written under a pen name, false name.
Yeah, and for those of you, so pseudepigrapha, meaning like pseudonym, like written by someone who's using not their name. Apocryphal meaning like, hey, I guess you correct me if I'm wrong, like was kind of sometimes by some people considered in the Bible, but is not.
And for, Protestants would call a lot of books like Maccabees and things like that apocryphal, whereas in the Catholic tradition, they would say deuterocanonical or second canon. So that would be some of the distinction too. But yeah.
Yeah, and Book of Enoch would be the closest to apocryphal between the two of them, but it's not apocryphal. It's never really been considered by any Orthodox, as far as my understanding. And I'm not a pro on this. I did a fair amount of digging the last few weeks prepping for this, but as far as I can see, I
think you and I have talked before. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church is about the only tradition that would hold the Book of Enoch as part of the canon.
Yeah, and that's not
pretty niche.
Yeah, that's but what's interesting is that we see the Book of Enoch quoted not just in the Book of Jude, but elsewhere in the New Testament. I think I shouldn't hazard a guess, right? Oh yeah, Second Peter for sure. I think it even comes up possibly, at least vaguely, in one of the Gospels.
I don't think directly, but maybe some of the ideas or content.
Yeah, Second Peter for sure. There's a lot of overlap with Second Peter and Jude. It seems like they're somehow dancing together, like maybe one read the other before writing. And I think the assumption is that Peter wrote after.
I have no idea. Yeah. And I think dates get a little bit.
Yeah. But no,
it's guessing.
No, yeah, for sure. And we do have, like I mentioned, Jude does reference. He specifically says, like, hey, don't forget what the apostles told you. It's not clear exactly, like, which epistle he's quoting. He could be quoting quite a few different books of the New Testament, or he could just be quoting something that the apostles are going around saying that also gets recorded in the epistles. Mm-hmm. But it seems to be like, okay, he's referencing the New Testament there. So it's interesting how many references he has over and over. He's got tons of Old Testament references. And what can be a little confusing as you're reading, and I would say definitely has been my experience reading Jude in the past, but not digging in as deep as I did more recently. As you're reading through the Book of Jude, he's just like rapid firing these references left and right, reference. And he's enmeshing them. And so you kind of assume, because he references Cain and Balaam and Korah, which are some pretty like niche Bible stories, right? Cain we know, but like I'm sure plenty of people listening are like, what is Korah's rebellion and what is the error of Balaam? Well, those are niche Bible stories. Actually, I've been telling my son Silas the story of Balaam, mostly because I asked myself the question, what are Bible stories that have animals? Yeah. And Balaam's got a donkey who talks back to him. So that's a pretty niche Bible story, but it's got an animal in it. So it became a bedtime story. But so he's referencing, some more known Old Testament stories and some more kind of niche ones, some more like less well-known ones. And then he throws in a couple of things that sound like Bible references. Like we're talking about Moses and Moses's body and Michael. And we're talking about some things that are kind of referencing Genesis 6. But then you like go flipping through the pages of the Old Testament and you're like, where the heck is this?
It's almost like, have you seen the meme of how to offend 5 groups at once? And it's a picture of Captain Jean-Luc Picard from the Star Trek Next Generation. And it's his quote up there saying, use the Force, Harry, Gandalf. And so you've taken 5 things together in a short space and you've misquoted all of them in that case. But in Jude, you have in a very small space, hey, I'm pulling 5 different things into one little letter. And, for someone who hasn't watched either Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, Star Trek Next Generation, any of those things in that one thing, it'd be like, I have no idea what this is about. Yeah. But for someone who knows all of them, they look at it and laugh right away and go, oh, I know exactly what it's about. He's, pulling in reference. 5 different things all at once. And so in the context of Jude, he can hit 5 things all at once that his audience is going, oh, I know all of those, and you're mixing and pulling them together and everything else. They're not necessarily, especially since some of it's extra biblical, part of our thought world. So we have to do a little extra digging, and that's kind of the context of what we're doing here is like, well, how is this part of their thought world? What's going on? Why don't we know about these books? Yeah.
Well, it can be so confusing. And then you end up thinking like, gosh, is this like some sort of weird mystical part of following God that I don't know about? Like, how does Jude, like, and where is this? Because we have that experience, right? As you read the Bible over the years, especially in the earlier years of reading the Bible, you come across references to the Bible all the time inside the Bible that you don't necessarily pick up on,
right?
You know, or that you can tell like that's a reference, but what's it like? Where's it a reference to? And so you just kind of put it in the category of like, I don't know that story, you know. And then as you read it year after year after year, you're like, oh, I do know what Korah's rebellion was. I do know Balaam's error. What's being referenced there? But then you're still left with that category that maybe you use less often of like, oh, that's just a reference from the Bible I'm not getting. And so when he talks about Archangel Michael battling over the body of Moses with Satan, you're like, where's that from? And what's funny is we think, based off of some writings of some of the early church theologians, that's a reference to a work called either the Assumption / Ascension and or Testament of Moses. And as I was looking at that, it's interesting that those may have been one body of work, or it may have been like kind of a part A, part B, two bodies of work that might have been pushed together. I was going to say, for the ending of the Ascension of Moses, it's just fragmentary in terms of what's left over, or we actually have no manuscript evidence for the ending part that's actually quoted. What we do have is writings of the early church fathers, things like that, where there's enough to reconstruct it. To me, it's almost like the Silmarillion for Tolkien that was posthumously published, where his son kind of took, okay, we have most of it, and I can fill in the gaps and make it a complete book. But it's a little bit speculative in some of it. But there's some connecting the dots, and there's enough material to go off of to reconstruct it. And that's something like what we have in the Ascension of Moses. Because what we have is so if it was a two-part thing, what we have is probably what would be the Testament of Moses. So, which is actually a quick read. I got it off Audible for $2 and listened to it in like 10, 15 minutes the other day. And it's kind of, what's interesting is both of these work, both the Book of Enoch and the Testament of Moses. The way I've been thinking about them is like a spinoff. And that's actually what was interesting for me is as I read the Book of Enoch a month or so ago, and as I read the Testament of Moses the other night, it was like activating the like sci-fi fantasy part of me that enjoys a good spinoff and a good like zoom into a niche of this character or whatever. Because the Book of Enoch really is a spinoff of Genesis 6, right? You have this very random passage about these divine beings sleeping with human women and these, Nephilim being born and all this chaos there. And you're like, what the heck? Where did that come from? And it's very intriguing, and you spend lots of time thinking and talking about it if you're a Bible nerd. This very random little passage, and then you read the Book of Enoch, and you're like, "Oh, like this gets fleshed out. Like here's more of this story." And with the Testament of Moses, right? Like it just kind of zooms in on one detail of Moses just about to pass away, and then we have his testament, some things that he says to Joshua, and then what we assume we're missing in the Ascension of Moses in the part B of that work. Is some story about what happens after he dies, and we get some of that detail in the Book of Jude, if he is in fact referencing that, which again, we have some of the early church fathers who would have had that work in front of them, saying, like this is a reference to that. And so the detail we get in the Book of Jude is that apparently there was an argument, there was Moses and, not Moses, Gabriel, the angel Gabriel and Satan were battling over the body of Moses. And actually, I in preparation for the Book of Jude, I read through Michael Heiser, who wrote The Unseen Realm, pretty good book. He had on his podcast, Naked Bible, is that right? He had an 8-part series on the Book of Jude, and he spent a good deal of time really unpacking these references and talking about them. And I'd say he's a great resource to wrap your head around what's going on there. And also the Bible Project video on Jude handles it really succinctly. Mm-hmm. So if you're not a nerd who wants to listen to an 8-part, 40 to hour and a half episode podcast series on that, and you just want a quick little summary there, I'd say the Bible Project video, it really gets right to the practicals of how we address the Book of Enoch and Testament of Moses and Jude. The
bibliographic rabbit trail on that, sort of, so to speak, is that Michael Heiser and Tim Mackey did the same Hebrew program and overlapped briefly. I think it was at the University of Wisconsin.
Oh, okay.
So they knew each other from that, and so there's a lot of connection between them and some back and forth. So
interesting.
Michael Heiser ends up being a source for a lot of Tim Mackey's stuff in that vein. Besides Tim Mackey's own work.
That's true. I remember the Bible Project did a whole series on spiritual beings, which is essentially the short, sweet, palatable, and visually interesting version of a couple of Michael Heiser's books.
And I think just to take a step back, even when you see expansions on things in Scripture, if we go into any of the pastors' libraries here, there's going to be the Bible, but there's going to be a bunch of books about the Bible. Mm-hmm. And I think because in ancient times we think less of every individual rabbi or scribe having a whole bunch of scrolls and things like that because books are a little more rare.
Yeah.
But what they do is writing didn't stop just because, okay, we have this canon and that's it.
Yeah.
But you have a lot of expansions. There's Targums, Midrash, Peshers are all different forms of writing about it. And in comparison to the approach that a modern scholar might take, where you might survey all of it and look at, here's all the data points and everything else and put together a collection, they expansively engage in some of the ideas. So the Targums that were with Hebrew language going out, you get Aramaic Targums that kind of are a retelling of, here's the scripture, but I'm going to do it in the Message format, mm-hmm. so to speak, where it's a paraphrase and you kind of expand and fill in some gaps and things like that. Or if you look at Josephus, he was a Jewish resident that it says he at one time was even a Pharisee. And when the Romans come to destroy Jerusalem, he switches sides and ends up being a general in the Roman army. And then for his Roman audience, he writes an Antiquities of the Jews, which he basically just retells all of the Old Testament in his own words.
Yeah.
And so you have a lot of materials from the, from history, from ancient history, that are just expansions on things. And that's kind of their scholarly take on things. And so when we see things quoting it, we kind of go, wait, is it scripture? Is it not scripture?
Yeah.
And ultimately it's, this is the thought world going on around these scriptures and how, the scripture is happening not just in a vacuum, but it's in the midst of culture. And here's how culture is responding to it, engaging in it with different thoughts on it.
Yeah. Yeah. I spent a lot of time asking the question, what does it mean that Jude quotes and references these passages? Well, and I think what you just said is the stuff we can really safely say, right? And furthermore, what does that mean to us as we do or do not engage with the Book of Enoch, the Testament of Moses, right? How do we read that when we read that? So, and I think the thing that I could really safely say is agree with everything that you just said. And especially if you're going to read them, they are valuable context because as the New Testament is being written, followers of Jesus and the Jews, whether both the ones who had and had not started following Jesus, they were reading these books. And so it's context. It's something that can be referenced. And like you were saying, when we make pop culture references, it's important to pick up on that. One of the things that you learn when you move to another country or learn a new language is how frustrating it is that it's not enough to learn the vocabulary, right? You have to learn the idiomatic expressions. That's the next layer past learning the vocabulary and the grammar. You have to learn what are the phrases that they say here. I had a really fun time doing that, actually, when we lived in Indonesia. They had all sorts of really interesting little peribahasas, is what they call them, little proverbs, idiomatic expressions, things like that. And like one of the ones I love is it says "Ada gula ada semut," and that means if there's sugar, there's ants. And it kind of means like, hey, like if you're being prosperous, like somebody's showing up wanting to get a bite. You know, they're wanting to, like there's brown nosers showing up. They're wanting to engage. And we spent time with our like cultural linguistic tutor, actually going over kids stories, not like books, but like what's the word, like parables or fables. That's the word I'm looking for. Fables, Indonesian fables, and it was really insightful. One of the things I learned living there is that if you want to learn something about a culture, pay attention to how they communicate to and interact with and what they teach children, because that's the stuff that gets written on the hearts of adults.
Right.
It's the stuff that was ingrained in them when they were little kids, right? So like you'll see there are no left-hand culture. You can't use your left hand because they wipe with their left hand. And so you'll see moms regularly from the time a kid is, before they're even a toddler, a little kid reaches for something and mom will gently slap their left hand and say jangan kiri, which means like don't use your left hand. And so as an adult, it's like it just feels wrong to use the left. It feels obviously rude, which it wouldn't for us. And as I'm learning these fables, they have this one really prevalent character in their fables is a kancil, which is like I think a mouse deer is the English word for it. It's this tiny little deer that's kind of tricksy in their stories, and he's the protagonist, right? And he's crafty and clever, and he's kind of a Jacob character, you know. And my language tutor was explaining to me something I realized, which is like this is a virtue in a lot of Indonesian culture. The virtue of being a Jacob character, of being a bit of a trickster, of like, hey, being kind and gentle and sweet and timid, but I got my way. Yeah. And I mean, that informs so much. And anyway, all that to say, you learn these things and you learn about the culture and the context, and you pick up on these references. I got way off there. Sorry. Oh, no. And so for us, as we're reading the Bible, it's not for everybody. Not everybody needs to do it. Some people, it can be simple enough to watch a Bible Project video that explains the reference, and there you go. But for those of us who want to dig a little bit deeper and who want to think about these things a little bit more, it can be really valuable to try to immerse ourselves in the context of the first readers and the authors of the Bible, both Old and New Testament. And so that's where I found reading the Book of Enoch and the Testament of Moses to be useful. I didn't have any big takeaways from them. It was useful for that and entertaining, like I said, for the fantasy part of me. So that's all comfortable.
I think one of the things, like I'll start with saying considering genre is really important. And as an example, if 500 years from now, someone digs up the podcast between you, me, and David Stockton, where we start talking about Lord of the Rings and the Palantirs, the seeing eyes, and how those work and everything else, and they go, did they really believe in the Lord of the Rings? Didn't they, like, is that true? Did they expect that was real? Or what's going on? And you know, in our context, we know, like, no, you can look at this story that's, you know, in terms of like magical powers, all those things, it's off the charts in terms of the sci-fi kind of element to it. But the themes that are told through that story, it's like, oh, we can pull these truths out, and they're true in our context. And so as we look back at Enoch, understanding genre, it makes a huge deal of difference. And the genre that it's written in is, you know, Second Temple apocalyptic literature, which
Second Temple, by the way, just always trying to add context as we talk about context. Second Temple literature, meaning it was written during the time that the Second Temple was around, right? And usually not so much latter Second Temple. I feel like it could get, because that would be the beginning of the New Testament, but we don't really refer to.
It would include up to the destruction of the Second Temple. So
okay.
there's things that would fall into the bit. Yeah. So
that would mean post-exile. So post-exile and when pretty much, I guess technically within the New Testament. But I feel like usually and maybe there just wasn't as much of a body of work there, or maybe it's just anecdotally and I'm wrong. I feel like usually we're talking about pre-1st century AD, but technically, obviously, the Second Temple's around until 70.
Yeah, I think because even a lot of the comparative literature coming from, Rome, the Latin side, things like that, then becomes important in that time period as well.
Yeah.
Even though it may be, focused on other material, but it impacts how we see what was going on in Judea in the Second Temple time frame as well.
Yeah.
So it's during that time period, and there's even in Anchor Bible Dictionary, there's an article written by a man named John J. Collins, not John Collins from the Bible Project, but just a different biblical scholar, talking about the different elements of apocalyptic literature, talking about its, highly symbolic kind of stuff going on. It's usually for an oppressed people group, not always, but most frequently it is. Sometimes can be cryptic on purpose. It usually has the presence of angelic beings. A lot of times angelic beings end up being the tour guide in the visions and things like that. And then most frequently it picks a figure from the ancient past, and in general it'll say, this is for a much later time, seal up the words of this prophetic word, this vision, this thing that I've shared. It's for a much later time. And then when you open it up, it's now the time that it's actually written in. So like the Apocalypse of Abraham, no one believes is written by Abraham, but it addresses what's going on in time right now. For Enoch, no one believes that we have something going back all the way to Enoch that was kept through all these ages, because he is told, seal it up, it's for a much later time, but the time that it's useful for would be during the Second Temple period. When
Enoch would have been pre-flood.
Yes.
And the Book of Enoch, as best we can tell, was written in maybe the second or third
century, first maybe BC. Even, so it's in
a few hundred years before Jesus.
Yes,
but not a lot of 100 years, just a couple.
Yes, and then even, and I had mentioned, genre, when you're working within a medium, a specific art frame, things like that, you kind of stay within the bounds, but good art knows how to push the bounds a little bit. And that's where, like, even in the Book of Revelation, which is an apocalypse or apocalyptic literature, you have the words of, don't seal it up, it's not for a later time. And that's where you're kind of, here's a twist on the genre, which we normally expect this to be for some much later time. And there's elements that, yes, it's future looking, but it's useful right now kind of thing. And it wasn't a figure from the ancient past. It was John at Patmos kind of thing.
Yeah. When you have, so that, I guess that brings us to a big question. I think people talk a lot less about the Testament of Moses because it's really short, it's incomplete. What we've only had for a while. I think the manuscript of it, I think we just have one, and it's not all there. It's hard to read some of it. And I think we've only had it for a while, if
I'm not sure as far as like when the discovery of it was and things like that. So
but we haven't actually had it. At least haven't had it for more than a couple hundred years, I think. But I think maybe even less than that. Actually, something is telling me late 1800s.
It's very likely. There's a lot of stuff that's discovered 19th century, and kind of what we have from ancient history really ramps up. With some different figures in the 19th century that do a lot of digs and have a lot of significant discoveries. And then the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the 1940s was huge.
So, but anyway, people don't talk about Testament of Moses, but people do talk about the Book of Enoch a lot because we have it. It's there. Some people do tend to go to it and be like, oh, is this the Bible? It's got that vibe to it as you read it. Like it reads like Old Testament a little bit. Because it's Second Temple Jewish literature, like a lot of the Old Testament, right? But it's interesting, and then you have it referenced in the New Testament. So that begs a series of questions, right? So what does that mean? And so, like, we could even just like zoom it in for a second to Jude. Like, what does the relationship with Jude and the Book of Enoch mean? The fact that Jude is referencing the Book of Enoch the way it does. Well, one answer would be, well, Jude doesn't belong in the Bible then. If the Book of Enoch isn't in the Bible and Jude is referencing it and referencing its details, then we could say, well, let's get rid of Jude. And that question has been asked and answered. It belongs in the Bible. The Book of Jude is true, authoritative, inspired by God. It fits, and it should be there, and I'm glad it is there. And the church has resoundingly said yes, although that question has, come into play. The next question is, well, then if Jude belongs in the Bible, does the Book of Enoch also belong in the Bible? And again, this question has been asked and answered over and over and over again. And the answer has been, no, it does not. And so then we're left with, okay, well, if that's the conclusion, if the Book of Enoch doesn't belong in the Bible and the Book of Jude does, and Jude does a little bit more than reference the Book of Enoch. This is the question I was having. The question then is, what is Jude doing with the Book of Enoch? Is Jude doing what you're saying and simply culturally referencing that? We actually talked about this a couple weeks ago when I was just starting to study the Book of Jude. And I didn't love your answer at first, which is pretty much what you just articulated of like, hey, this is context, this is culture, like he's just referencing a thing. The more I've been studying this, the more I think that's actually very plausible. Like, I wouldn't say I'm sold on it, but I think I'm leaning that way now of, well, I think the answer is that this was in the air that they were breathing, and they're just talking about the stuff that everybody's reading. And it doesn't necessarily mean that Jude is affirming the details, because that's the difference here. He doesn't just reference it or quote a quick line here. He references, the testament of Moses and says like, hey, remember when, Michael and Satan were battling over the body of Moses? You remember that, guys? And he says like, hey, this is what Enoch said, But the more I've dug in it, the more I think, well, like that does not explicit. I think even your analogy of us talking about the Lord of the Rings is fitting. And again, Jude is so small, so short, so brief. There's not a lot of internal context to the Book of Jude, and it is reference, right? So I think that is pretty plausible. The other option that occurred to me as I was chewing on it would be to say, well, okay, if Jude is not simply just referencing it for reference it, because I think that is an assumption. Like, I don't think we can definitively say that Jude was not confirming those details in the Testament of Moses and the Book of Enoch.
I think just as a quick comparative, when Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, if we come away going, was there really a Good Samaritan or not? Have we been good listeners to what Jesus was teaching? And it's one of those things where it's like, actually, the answer doesn't really matter.
Yeah, there's a lot of truth to that. But I think here's where the answer does matter here, though, is how do I treat the Book of Enoch? You know what I mean? Like, am I going to go read it, and how am I going to treat it when I read it? And not to push back on, but I think it actually is worth.
Well, and even. So kind of an expansion for, okay, here's kind of what I think Jude's up to a little bit. So the Book of Enoch is an expansion of Genesis 6 with the Watchers and the Nephilim and everything else. The thing about that is Genesis 1 through 11 is seen to be come from a very Mesopotamian context in terms of, this is the law of Moses coming in its final form, quite possibly from somewhere in Babylon in exile. And there's a lot of reasons why. And for the Babylonians, their culture was great because of these figures.
Yeah.
And so Genesis 6 is a swipe at
these
Babylonian.
Kind of demigod.
It's making fun
figures,
of Babylonian theology, saying, you say, because they're referred to as the Apkallu, like these were the ones who gave technology and learning and wisdom and astrology to your culture and made Babylon so great. This is what they really are.
Yeah.
And then the writer of Enoch knows
it's really a perversion and a gross thing and a tragedy, rather than the source of honor and power and glory.
Yes, and even for people who are maybe familiar with Gilgamesh, a figure who's part god, part human.
Yeah, or more commonly, this has been really, I've been thinking about this a lot lately, just because it's been interesting to me. So the Philistines, right, who apparently more and more clearly seems to be, were more or less Greek in origin. I think Crete-ish, right?
Something like that.
Yeah, something around there, from which we get, Goliath and Gath and all those people up in the hill country of Ephraim, right? The Anakim, right? The Anakim, those are the Philistine ones, right? Who are giants, you know what I mean? So presumably, like, seems to be a tie-in for sure into this Nephilim, into this Genesis 6, somehow, somewhere, right?
Well, and this is the step back, because the writer of Enoch knows the Genesis story, but he also knows the Mesopotamian stories really well. And so the detail that comes out of it is actually also part of works that are mostly lost. Although we have something called the Enuma Elish, which is, it's just When on High is the title, but it's the Babylonian creation story and gives part of the detail. But then there were other works that gave great detail with all the names that are then given in Enoch for these figures that are the ones that see the daughters of men and go after them and everything else. So ultimately, it's a way to tar and feather. So in Genesis, what you have is they're tarring and feathering, or going, okay, I'm giving you this reference as who you are and what this culture is and how destruct and basically devious and bad it is.
Yeah.
And then Enoch is an expansion of that, going, here's the details of your writings as well as Genesis combined to tell the story. And then Jude is going, hey, if I want to tar and feather the false teachers, here's these cultural references that go, these are the kind of characters that they are. So they may be saying, we're liberated, we're free, we can do all these things, and it's distortions, and it's similar to these distortions.
Yeah.
So it's a way to quickly pull in a whole world to tar and feather false teachers in very short work.
Yeah. Well, that's a wonderful summary of what's happening there. I wanted to rewind and make one little point. You brought it back home to a much more pertinent place, but I'm going to go back to my little rabbit trail for a second.
Sure.
With the Greeks, right? And so it's been occurring to me, the connection there with the Greek demigods as well, right? So Hercules is not so dissimilar from Goliath.
Right.
It was the little less consequential point that I was going to make. But I think it's interesting, right, that you do have this consistent theme in the ancient world of these kind of half gods that are powerful and strong and huge, and the Cyclopses, right? Also
or the Titans.
The Titans in Greek mythology, right? And so you have this recurring theme, which again is pretty consistently like a great thing. And you even have these stories again in Greek mythology. Zeus is known for being a womanizer, right? For tricking women into sleeping with him and all sorts of assault and things like that, right? And in the Greek culture, it's funny, we look back on that and we're like, oh, how gross and how yucky. And we look at how, and we talk about the Greek mythology, and from our vantage point, we say, oh, it's so interesting that their gods were so bad and corrupt, and they viewed the gods as bad. But the reality is that doesn't necessarily mean that the Greeks weren't looking at this mythology and looking at these stories of their gods as virtues. It's not necessarily a bad thing in an ancient Greek mindset that Zeus
it's worth considering. They may not have the same value set we have and aren't reading it the same way.
Exactly. And so the biblical story and the biblical treatment of this whole situation this is depravity. This is brokenness. This is the fall. This is not a good thing. This is corruption. This is the spiritual realm stepping outside of the boundaries that God set, and the consequences of that are grave, in the same way that when we, who are meant to be physical and spiritual, step outside of the boundaries of the authority that God has given us. And that's even part of Jude's accusation and the mudslinging he's doing against these heretics, is he's saying, hey, they're engaging in sexual immorality, and they're also leaving proper authority structures. Both the implication seems to be maybe both and, maybe either or, that he's saying they're abandoning their role of authority as followers of Jesus, as human beings meant to have dominion over the world. They're abandoning their right role of authority, and or they're rebelling against the authorities that have been placed over them. And this is an issue, just as it was in Genesis 6, just as it gets expanded on in the Book of Enoch. And so that brings us back to the question, though, of so how do we treat the Book of Enoch? And I think one really safe option and good option is to just say, and what we can definitely say, and I don't mean safe in a negative way. I mean like here's the thing we can pretty confidently say: valuable context, useful to read, not the Bible. The next question, though, is like, well, he does seem to at least speak of these details. So either he's simply referencing them, or he might be confirming these details. And where I went with that train of thought, which is a little bit more dangerous, I'd say just take this with a grain of salt, and please don't go off here and start reading the Book of Enoch in your quiet times with Jesus. That's not at all what I'm indicating. But it's possible that maybe Jude was reading it in the same way we would read a book from an author, right? Recently, for example, Eric Metaxas wrote his letter to the American Church, which, did you read that?
I haven't seen
it. It's good. And Metaxas goes some places politically that I don't necessarily 100% line up with him, but I listened to him talking about, I read that book and I listened to him speaking on a podcast about the writing of that book. And he said it was a different book. Eric Metaxas is a wonderful biographer. I think my favorite biographer, really good writer. I've really enjoyed every single book he's written. He said, this book was so different. He said, I wrote this book with fear and trembling because I felt like the Lord was giving me a message, a prophetic message to the church in America, like in the beginning of Revelation. He's saying, not that I think that my book needs to be in the Bible, but he's saying I felt like God had a word that I had to bring, and it was terrifying, and that's pretty meaningful, right? And so I read that book, and I think, is God wanting to say something to me and to the church in America as I read this book? At the same time, I know that this is not the Word of God, right? That this is not the Bible. Like, if Eric Metaxas is delivering fearfully and with trembling a prophetic word to the church in America, that's worth hearing and being cautious about, especially because he's someone that I think really follows Jesus. I think I can trust, to a certain extent. But I'm going to take that word and I'm going to take it to the Lord, and I'm going to say, how much of this is right? How much of this is broken? How much of this is Eric messing up a little bit? And how much of it is actually your word here? I'm usually really cautious when someone very public says, I have a prophetic word. Mm-hmm. And he didn't really pitch the book that way. It's part of why I can listen to it a little bit more. I just heard him talking in a podcast saying, this was terrifying. And so as I read that book, like, I can weigh it. I can take it to the Lord. I can see, is there some of your spirit speaking to us in a book like this? But I'm never going to hold it up and read it the same way that I would read the first chapters of Revelation that are letters to the church,
Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder, did Jude maybe perhaps treat the Book of Enoch like that, the way I might read Eric Metaxas's A Letter to the American Church, saying, I think God is maybe revealing some things in here, but also this isn't the Bible. And we can confidently, and one of the issues with the Book of Enoch is there's theology that directly contradicts biblical theology. And Jesus even pushes back a little bit. I can't remember exactly the detail there, but I remember Michael Heiser talking about it. I think it was in his podcast. Jesus pushes back on the theology in the Book of Enoch in a couple of places, and actually pretty intentionally turns it up on its head when he's talking about, I think I'm on thin ice here because I don't know exactly what I'm talking about, but I'm pretty sure in reference to, who's invited, more or less, into the kingdom. And he's kind of slapping the Book of Enoch in the face a little bit and saying, you think these people are invited, but actually this is how it works. It's these people.
I think one of the things, just in general with apocalyptic literature, it actually is the space where people are working out what they're praying, thinking, reading, understanding from Scripture. And it's where we get a lot of messianic expectation. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that expectation, like even, the Book of Daniel has apocalyptic literature in it. And before the apocalyptic part in the early chapters, you have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego basically saying, King, know this, we won't bow down. You can throw us in the fire. Our God can save us. He will save us. And even if he doesn't save us. And it's kind of like, wait, how can it be all three of those? Because he can, he will, and if he doesn't, well, you're playing both sides a little bit. And I think the thing that gets built up within Second Temple apocalyptic literature is the expectation that God is going to do something that even if he has to raise the dead to justify himself, he will. And so you have this growing expectation that comes through the medium of apocalyptic literature, whether it's perfect theologically or not, or things like that. You get a lot of Son of Man, a lot of expectation of what is it that God's going to do. And it wasn't that they had a clear and perfect picture, because you can even think of John the Baptist sending the message to Jesus. He doesn't say, are you the Messiah? He says, are you the one to come? Because there's kind of this wide shelf space of, we know God's going to act in some way where he's going to break into this world and set things right. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like. There's, messianic things, there's Son of Man things, there's, wisdom, there's all this different shelf space where the expectation is, because of God's character and who he is and what he said thus far in Scripture, we know he's going to show up and act. And so a lot of that apocalyptic writing is the expansion of, okay, here's expectation coming, where God is going to break into this world with another worldly kind of hope. So I think that kind of fits some of the things for First Enoch and why Jude would quote from it, and because now God has broken in the person of Jesus Christ, and everything else is just.
Yeah, I think it's really good, really valuable context. Honestly, I think the bulk of the pay dirt is just an understanding, right? Jude is referencing the Book of Enoch. He's got that quote where he says like ungodly, 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 ungodly 10,000 times. If I remember correctly, that's the one I think where he's almost quoting, and probably is pretty much quoting, but maybe imperfectly so, or maybe getting lost in translation a little bit. The Book of Enoch. Obviously, when he says, hey, when Enoch, the seventh from Adam, which is how Enoch is titled in the Book of Enoch, what follows there is a reference to the Book of Enoch. We already talked about the Michael and Satan battling over Moses. That's the Testament of Moses. There might be one more Enoch reference in the Book of Jude. Can't remember. That might be both of them, but just knowing that that's what's going on there, it makes it a lot less confusing. Oh, when he talks about there's possible reference, right? He's playing with it when he accuses the heretics of sexual immorality and he has some accusation about authority with them, and then blaspheming the glorious ones.
Yeah, holy ones or angels or heavenly beings.
That one's a little bit of like, I'm not entirely sure what you're saying there, Jude, but it's very likely that he's playing with Book of Enoch stuff, because thematically, one of the interesting things that Jude is doing when he plays with the Enoch references, which is shorthand, like you're saying. It's a shorthand for spiritual beings engaging in sexual immorality with human beings. And then he references Sodom and Gomorrah, which is a story of human beings engaging in sexual immorality with spiritual beings, and sexual misconduct there. And so there's something really interesting going on there. There's a symmetry in his accusations against these people, and so there's a roundedness and a spiritual nature to his accusations of sexual immorality. And I think that's interesting, because one of the things that you see pretty consistently in cults and other and also religions that are just particularly unhealthy and out of bounds, right? Is a sexual divine combination. And so I'm if we're reading between the lines, it's not much of a stretch to assume that part of what he's pretty explicit about saying, hey, they've turned it into the gospel into something sensual is the word that the ESV used, but I think licentious might be a little bit more accurate, but that's a weird word that nobody uses. Like in other words, giving license to, but there's with a sexual connotation, right? And so anyway, I don't know. It seems like, if we're reading between the lines about what he's talking about, it smells like there's somebody going around, or there's some people going around who are saying like, hey, like, let's engage in sexual immorality, and it's a holy thing, it's a good thing, it's a religious thing, it's a religious experience. Sleep with me and you'll get close to God, or something along those lines. And I'm reading between the lines there. There's no indication that somebody said that, but that's the kind of thing that gets said all the time.
Well, there's a reality within the New Testament, and even like in the Lord's Prayer, as in heaven, so on earth. And so there's a heaven and earth reality that's always going on. And so they're distorting the heaven and earth reality into something that it's not. But even, less on that vein a little bit, but just in terms of the heaven and earth reality, there's another Mesopotamian work called the Era Epic, and even the context for the Babylonian creation epic, things like that. It's the throwing out of the old and coming in with new deities. But in the Era Epic, they talk about, the current God that's running things is getting senile and old and out of touch and everything else, and we want to displace him. And underneath it was, okay, in their context, Sumeria was the previous kind of, stronghold of power, rulers, everything else, and the Babylonians replaced the Sumerians, but it's kind of within its own self at some level. I'm not an expert on it, but so you have the writing of here's what's going on, the war going on in the heavenlies, and here's the expression on earth of it, which is here's the falling of one empire and the rising of another. And so there's some sort of sense of there's a heaven and earth reality that's going on, and you can either be plugging into things that are basically demonic and leading you into the kinds of behaviors that are not from God, and it's a heaven and earth reality kind of thing, heavenly realm or spiritual realm and earth sort of thing, when what God wants is his will on earth as it is in heaven. And so that's where there's kind of a splitting of the direction that, these false teachers are taking people, and where you can fill in the blanks of what might that be. We speculate. We know it was something not good.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Do you see? I talked about it a little bit more frankly in one of the services, I think, than the other ones. But do you see a connection with Jude's warning against antinomianism, right? So that and what we're dealing with in the church at large these days, especially in the West, of sexual immorality, getting endorsements, or do you think that I'm making a little stretch when I'm connecting those dots?
In terms of, I think it could be legit whether it would have gone under the heading of antinomianism back then, where they might not be from the mindset of here's Protestant theology from the 16th century that we've taken and distorted into now we're free for everything. But, having their own version of that. So,
because a lot of churches that are landing there, they definitely would not articulate what they're saying in a way that looks like antinomianism on paper.
Right.
They would say this is not a sin.
Yeah, and it is ultimately being able to come from a good place of understanding, how do we use the law? Am I under the law? Which laws do I have to follow? Are we free to do anything because I'm and it does become a distortion if you go, how you live doesn't matter. Like, that's not what Scripture is saying at all. And even some of it would be, in the context, like, let's say Romans 10:4 that talks about Jesus is the end of the law. He's the telos of the law. You can read that as, oh, Jesus does away with the law, and now we don't have to care about it anymore. Or Jesus was what it's kind of
the final form.
An oak tree is the telos of an acorn.
Yeah.
And the law is what Jesus was always pointing at Jesus. So the law was there to point us to Jesus, and now he doesn't go in some different direction. Or even, some of the things quoted in Hebrew from Jeremiah 31 about, I'll take out your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh, and I'll write my law upon it. It's literally saying, I will write my Torah on your heart.
Yeah.
So it's not throwing away the law. And even in Hebrews talking about what was wrong with the law was essentially, it was the people who couldn't carry it out. So what does God do? He remakes the people. He doesn't throw out the law. He doesn't set it aside. He sets it inside. And it's not that, okay, so these are the rules that you follow. This is what the law was always aiming at. And so we go in the direction of what it was always aiming at, which is now we follow Jesus, as opposed to the law being our tutor that gets us there. It's the Spirit and the Spirit-led shaped life.
Yeah, I think I think was interesting for me in connecting the dots of Jude's warning to what we're dealing with in the church, in particular in regards to sexuality, was on paper, on your theological categories paper, by the definition of antinomianism, it as I was thinking about it, feels like, depending on the person or the church or the denomination, it may or may not fall in antinomianism, but most are trying to avoid at least the appearance of antinomianism, if not, are trying to avoid it genuinely, because most are not. There was a time, but it feels like at this point in time, within the category of people who are saying that they're Christians, who are let's say affirming, right, or saying the louder voice, the more prevalent voice, the more prevalent argument has been, it's not sin. But there certainly is, and I think initially, as it was seeping into the church, the argument was it's okay, like it's fine, But then when you look at the reasoning of how do they get to the conclusion it's not sin, there are some attempts at playing with the Bible to do that. There's a few of them. They're all pretty flimsy, but they are there, and so. But then most seem to run with the thought process of God is so kind and loving and merciful, and so how could this thing that I desire not be something He wants to give me? And so that to me, that thought process sounds very similar to it's not identical to antinomianism. But it's definitely a cousin to it, of saying, well, God is so merciful and kind, and I want this thing, and I desire this thing, and this is inborn in me. So how could it not be His desire to give me this good thing? As opposed to antinomianism, which would be God's forgiven you, so whatever you want is okay. God is merciful, therefore what you want is okay, as opposed to God is merciful, therefore of course He wants to give me this thing I want.
Well, and that does seem to be the thing that Jude says. They take the grace of God as a license to do whatever they want, whereas you see within Scripture, I think in 1 Timothy or actually Titus, for it's the grace of God that teaches us to say no to worldly passions and desires. So it's not that the grace is just used for, I did whatever I wanted and now I'm forgiven. It's this thing called grace actually delivers me on the front end of it and seeing it differently that way. And so Jude would definitely be kind of taking that line where it's like, no, the grace of God is not a license so you could do things. It actually keeps you from those things.
It's interesting. I've even heard people use Jude as an argument against the biblical standard of sexuality. It's one of those passages they'll go to, and it's interesting because to hear Michael Heiser actually discuss it. The thought process is, well, Jude is pointing us to the reality that the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah was the primary sin that Jude is highlighting, actually, as far as the sexual immorality goes, is the sexual interaction between divine beings and human beings. I've heard that a little more common argument is that, the issue in Sodom and Gomorrah is inhospitality, which of course is and was a very huge part of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. That's one of the things that we're meant to be shocked by in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is the atrocious inhospitality, which doesn't hit us as Americans as hard as it would hit a Middle Eastern or an ancient Jew. But so that's true. But then the argument is, well, so really the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah is inhospitality, or the sexual sin of Sodom and Gomorrah is men sleeping with spiritual beings, and it has nothing to do with homosexuality. But I think that fails, that feels like quite a bit of gymnastics to say that that these are the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah to the exclusion of homosexual assault, or even homosexual interaction. I think that the point of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is we're meant to come face to face with a barrage of immorality that's shocking, and so it's all of those things that all of the above. It's not that there's one sin of the Sodomites and the Gomorrites that God was punishing them for. It's how deep and dark they had become that it was worth God saying, it's just better to get rid of this. Yeah.
Just as you and I had talked, just in terms of where your sermon was going was towards hope, or what's the resource that in a world where we have all these competing things going on and it can feel overwhelming and it can feel like, where do I even start?
Yeah.
I think one of the things about the apocalyptic genre in general, the goal of it was to generate hope. And ultimately it's not hope that just comes from this world. It's otherly world hope that you start going, oh, there is a day when God will set everything right, when all things will be, made as they should, where we're heading towards new creation. And in light of that, I can actually have hope in my current situation. So it's not just I'm going to escape. Eventually this is all going to burn up and I'm out of here. It's my future is so secure in terms of what God has for us that I can engage differently in this world now. Ultimately, I'm playing with house money kind of hope. And so that's, that apocalyptic genre, and just even, maybe in terms of just resummarizing where you were going in your sermon in terms of, so what is it that gives us hope?
Yeah. Yeah. So where we landed with that, which is interesting, right? Like, here's the actual sermon part of the sermon now that we're like an hour into the podcast. But that was some fun stuff to play around with and talk about, right? And so where we ended up after a little context and after the stuff that we thoroughly unpacked just now was rewinding all the way back to Jude verse 1, where Jude in the ESV it says, to those who are called, to those who are beloved of God, and to those who are kept for Christ. And I did a little bit of digging. It didn't take long to look into the Greek and really just go into Strong's Concordance, which is free in Blue Letter Bible, and realizing that word "called" there is not at all inaccurately translated, but I would assume the reason why the translators in the ESV chose the word "called" is because it's probably a little bit more it contains both of the connotations of the word in the Greek, and so I would assume it's a bit of when in doubt, let's go with the word that actually harmonizes with both of the different meanings here. But I think the problem is that when we hear the word "called" in English, especially in church, the connotation we tend to run with is, like your calling in life, your purpose and the goal and the direction and the final destination of your life, as opposed to, hey, I called you over here. And in the Greek, it has both of those connotations, right? And so probably "called" is a good choice there, because you don't know exactly what Jude's intentions were. But contextually, even just in the context of the New Testament, right? The New Testament, a major theme of the New Testament is being invited to the wedding feast of the Lamb. And so I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, well, to me, it smells like really what Jude is saying is to those who are invited. those who are called to the wedding feast, called, come on over here.
I think just in support of what you're saying, there's a book called Callings, and there's a subtitle to it, I forget, but it sort of traces how the word calling has changed meaning over 2,000 years of church history, depending on, there's the New Testament setting, and then there's 500 years in, and then, with the desert mothers and fathers, with now that, put in a post-Constantine era where it's okay to be a Christian. Well, called used to feel special. Now it doesn't, so we want to go in a monastery in the desert kind of thing. And then, and without going into too much detail, like lands on eventually it means what's my dream ministry job in Jesus as calling, and going back to the original within the New Testament, calling meant you're called out of one life and into another. You're called out of death and into life, essentially. And I think that's exactly you're invited into a new life.
Yeah.
It means new community, restructuring of everything. It's not that you leave the world, but you orient to the world differently than you did before. I've been called out of one kind of life that leads to death into new life.
Yeah, no, I think that's so good. I'm interested. You'll just send me that book, because I've been thinking about this a little bit. Like our understanding of the word calling is not necessarily counter-biblical, but it's not exactly the right flavor of what's being said. I think, to your point, to the point of that book you were referencing, and the theme of being invited to the wedding feast of the Lamb, or being called out of death into life, is a pretty significant theme in the Bible, and especially in the New Testament, that idea of invitation. So that was kind of what we spent some time talking about yesterday in the message was, well, as Jude is calling us to deal with this really difficult thing, how do we find the strength to deal with that, and to not just sweep it under the rug? And I just thought it was so interesting and powerful that Jude, Jesus' little brother, starts off his letter saying, hey, to those who are invited, beloved, and kept in Jesus. And that little note I made on in Jesus, right? That's in a footnote in most of the Bibles. That's there's
a nice net Bible footnote on
the
date of instrument or date.
Which, is, that's just, it's an interesting thing. So namely, right, we translate it to kept for Jesus or kept in Jesus. And you could speak to this a lot better than I could, I'm sure, because my understanding of Greek grammar is pretty rudimentary. But generally speaking, I do know in language, oftentimes you have these ambiguities that, and for us, the question is, I think a lot of people tend to think of translation as a one-to-one thing, right? So like, what's the Greek word for to, or Greek word for, or Greek word for in, which I think there's not even a preposition there, right? Is it just grammatical?
The case ending is what governs it. Yeah.
So A, there's not even a word to translate there. B, that ambiguity is just the way a language functions. And so, whereas we're wondering which it is, the truth is grammatically it's both, and yet they of course have an understanding of the differences between what we think of when we think of in or for, but at the same time they're not necessarily like an ancient Greek speaker doesn't have that as a clear-cut category in their mind.
I hate to make another Tolkien reference, but in the movie The Hobbit, when Bilbo says good morning to Gandalf, and he's like, what do you mean by that? Is it a good morning for it to be a morning? Is it good? And then he gives like 5 different ways to take good morning. And it's like, I just meant good morning. Yeah. And it can be similar to that.
Or I remember one time when I was in Indonesia, I was teaching English class, and I was teaching the English class to a couple women who were just learning English. And I had a friend in the room who's Indonesian, whose English was wonderful, just kind of there doing some other tasks, wasn't part of the class. And we were talking about I forget the grammatical name for the tense, but the tense we use in English when we say I would have been, or I will have gone to the store. That's the one. I will have gone to the store tomorrow. And that's a tense that they don't have in Indonesian. And if you think about it, it's actually an oddly very specific tense, right? And so I was having a hard time articulating this particular tense of what does it mean that I will have gone to the store. to these women who were learning English. And so I went to my friend whose English was really wonderful because I knew that they didn't have this tense in Indonesian. And I said, well, how do you explain this? And she said, oh, it's the same as oh wait, I should say, actually, we're talking about in the past.
Sounds like a future perfect.
Yeah. Well, this whole category of tenses they don't have, right? But if I had said, gosh, where did I lose it? It's in the, well, basically she said, it's the same as I will go to the store. And I said, no, it's not. I didn't understand it. My friend who's fluent in English didn't understand the difference. Yeah. And in her brain, even though she was perfectly fluent, she had literally just said, they're the same thing. And that's how I make sense of it. Yeah. That blew my mind a little bit. And that helped me realize something, which is that, when you're crossing languages, there are just some things that the ambiguity is the way your brain works. Mm-hmm. And it is very difficult to pick up a difference there. And so for a Greek reader, not knowing particularly how clear that ambiguity is, because there were other ambiguities, Indonesian word for shame and embarrassment is the same thing, but they know that there's a qualitative difference there. And embarrassment is very minor. Shame, that's not a big deal. And they do distinguish between that, right? But so for a reader in Jude, it's like, are you kept in Jesus or kept for Jesus? My assumption, based off of what little I know about the Greek language, is they're not asking that question. And that phrase is actually probably coming packed with both. It's probably coming packed with you're kept in Jesus and you're kept for Jesus. Now, obviously, that was way more difficult to articulate than something that was worth saying on a Sunday morning. So I do think you're kept for Jesus. But I also think if I had to pick, certainly in the context of the stuff that we were highlighting yesterday, you're kept in Jesus. But anyway, I mean, I could spend a few hours just thinking about the beauty of what that interplay is there. It's a useful thing. Ambiguity in language is almost as useful, if not more useful sometimes, than specificity in language. Yeah.
And leaving both open. Sometimes it's, ultimately it's nice to be made aware of both options, because then you end up holding on to both. I can't let go of this one. I prefer this one, but I just can't get rid of this one. Yeah. I get to hold on to what's beneficial about both.
Yeah, it's hard for me as an English speaker when I address a group of people in a language that has a plural form of you. I never know which one to use because, I shouldn't say I never. Sometimes I want to sound intimate. Mm-hmm. Right. And in English, the ambiguity of the fact that we don't have a you all unless you're in the South is that I can speak to a group of people and I can shift into a gear and make it sound like I'm speaking to one person. I'm speaking to you. But I can't do that implicitly and with the ambiguity in Indonesian or Spanish. I have to actually kind of break a grammatical rule and confusingly speak to one individual person in the room of a few hundred people. But anyway, the whole point of all of that was, I think Jude is trying to say, hey, like, God's invited you, he loves you, and he's keeping you, and you're safe. Yeah. That had me thinking a bit about, attachment theory and things like that. And, insecure attachment in particular, right? Like when you grow up in a world, in a family, in relationships, usually with mom or dad or, brother or sister, who are not stable, who are not there, who are not predictable, who are not safe. It actually colors the way you interact with the whole rest of the world. And the people who are most insecure in the world, like they didn't have that stability. I mean, insecure, I remember, I had a friend growing up. And I remember hearing, I think it was probably Nassim Taleb, who wrote Black Swan and a few other things. It's a mathematician-y thought guy these days. I got lost in some of his books, but actually I got one of the, Matt Gale gave me his Black Swan book recently, got me reading them. It's interesting. But anyway, I heard that guy mentioned on a podcast a while back that, there's a really interesting difference he's the one who coined the term anti-fragile, in particular in talking about children, right? So the idea that children are anti-fragile, that when they hit adversity, not only the right amount of adversity in the right environment, not only does it not break them, but they're not just resilient. They don't just get through it. They actually end up being stronger. Like our immune system would be an example of that, right? When we get sick, if it doesn't kill us, it makes us stronger, right? We're not just back to the same level. We're actually a little bit more robust afterwards. And of course he was talking the nuance of this in a podcast with someone and talking about like, well, sometimes when you make fun of a kid, it does crush them and it does make them weaker. And there's some interesting information in psychology about the relationship between home life, right, and kids who are bullied in particular. And I tried to find actually the studies that he was referencing there, and I wasn't able to find it. And then I went another direction with the sermon anyway. But the point being that when a kid is bullied at school, to a certain extent that isn't traumatic, that isn't like going to scar you no matter what, but just kind of normal, standard, getting picked on, bullied, maybe a slightly elevated level, but doesn't involve getting the snot kicked out of you on a regular basis or something like that. And they go home, the way that impacts the kid for the rest of their life depends less so on school and more so on home. Mm-hmm. So when a kid goes home to a stable home, right, when you get picked on by your bully at school and you go home and mom and dad love you and they encourage you, and maybe you bring it up with mom and dad, maybe you don't, I don't know, but like you're going home to stability, it's not going to really affect you significantly moving forward. You're going to have that anti-fragile response. You're actually going to get stronger and more resilient as a result of that. But when another kid goes home from getting picked on in the same way by the same bully, and they go home to mom and dad who are not together or who don't love each other or manic and unsafe, or there's abuse at home, well, now what this bully is doing, it's crushing the kid because there's no stable place to go and recoup from that and to get stronger. And I actually watched this play out in middle school. My best friend had not a bad home. He had parents who were decent, who loved Jesus, but and a stepdad who was a good guy who worked hard, but was an angry guy. Not abusive, but not predictable, and a older brother who didn't love him, and some quite a bit of brokenness in the home, and I had a family that at the time was together and full and whole and following Jesus and stable, and we both got picked on in junior high. He ultimately got picked on quite a bit more, I think, because the way you respond to it has a pretty big difference. But we were getting picked on by the same people, and I would not have said I was being bullied, even if the same things had happened, because I was going home and I was fine with it, and I was moving forward, and it really was not ruining my life. Although in junior high and 7th grade, it sucked, but he was going home to something just as unstable, and it crushed him. And he wasn't able to have, I shouldn't say that's an exaggeration, but not least of which would be the fact that he couldn't confidently talk to a girl that he liked until he was about 27 years old, because he was just getting crushed. It had an impact on areas of his life that seem unrelated. And so all that is to say, there's a real significant amount of power in stability, in the comfort and the safety that we find, and we're meant to find it at home. Mm-hmm. And finding it at home really is meant to be just God's kind of front lines for showing us his love and his security and the stability that he offers us. And for those of us who don't find it at home, who have anxious attachment or insecure attachment or anything other than secure attachment, we can go and find it in the Lord. There's quite a bit of security and stability to be found in him.
As a way to tie it to your sermon message, you've been invited into a home that is stable, and it's the household of God. And whether your house looks like that or not, you're invited into this kind of house, and you're also invited to make whatever house you're in, hey, give my piece to that house kind of thing. Yeah. And if they don't want it, that's fine. Move on. And, basically, we're invited into this household of God that has peace that we're invited to share, not as the world gives peace, but, as Jesus gives us peace.
Not to put you on a spot, but do you have a story that comes to mind of a time when maybe you experienced some of that stability in the kingdom?
Yeah. When someone came into my home and shared peace when there was not peace at my home, my senior year is when my parents split up, and the short version is it was extremely tumultuous, and I remember my mom wasn't home, my dad was gone, and I was really sick and had 17 years old, and my oldest brother was out of the house. My younger brother was there, and having a couple from our church that just came in, and I was so sick laying on a couch, knowing my home life had been ripped up. And there's that proverb about, even in sickness, a man's spirit sustains him, but a broken spirit who can bear? And just laying there and feeling sick and broken inside, and having a couple come into my house and lay hands on me and pray for me and feel the presence of God in a way that was so strong, where it was like, okay, there is hope in this world. This is someone bringing hope from their house of God, and sharing it into my house that's currently ripped up. And so, just having that was my senior year, and it was a pretty messed up year in life. And it was one of those moments where I felt the presence of God so strong in the midst of all of that. So,
and what's really beautiful is just occurring to me is just someone who knows you and loves you and knows your family a little bit, is how much you and your wife have created a place of stability for your girls and for a lot of other people. You guys are a place of refuge and invitation. And I don't think I've ever spent time with Riccios and not felt valued. And I think what's beautiful is how much that's true of your girls, and has been since they were little. I've gotten we haven't been super close, but we've been close enough that it's kind of actually fun watching your girls grow up, because we're not like Auntie Colleen and Uncle Alec, but we're familiar faces, and so that kind of means that we have little, little moments where we get to spend a little more time with your girls here or there, kind of throughout the years, and it kind of means like getting little snapshots. Not like we don't see them for years at a time, but like, we have a more meaningful interaction here, and then a year later, more meaningful interaction. And ever since they were little, I think that's been very true. Like I remember them being little and being over to your house and feeling actually invited, not just by you and Lisa, but by your girls. And I think that just as you're saying that and knowing, bits of that story and how much brokenness there was, it's just such a powerful thing. I think the ability to, and really, I think that's what Jesus was praying for when he taught us to pray, on heaven on earth as it is in heaven, is bringing that stability, that invitation, following with Jesus, the power and capacity that you've had to stand in the gap and not pass that down to your girls, but to give them secure attachment, to say the least.
It's our hope, but we're flawed parents, but and thank you for the kind words, and you and Colleen are lights to our girls, and we're super grateful for you guys, and they're super grateful, and you guys are rock stars to them. Yeah. So
thanks. They're a lot of fun. I think that's a pretty good place to land. I think probably there. We spent a lot of time talking about things that are fun to nerd out on, but I love about you, Dan, that we can nerd out on those things, but it's not just all about your intellect. It really is consistently, this is just a place where I get to learn a little bit more about Jesus, who I love. And that's our hope when we spend an hour or more talking about the Book of Enoch and biblical context and theology and Greek and Hebrew and all that, isn't that we would just pretend we're smarter, right? It's so that we would just do a lot of work to get just a drop more of Jesus, because it's worth squeezing hard. And every little bit of understanding about who Jesus is and who he's calling us to be, and where he's inviting us, it's been worth every ounce of effort. So thanks for hanging with me on that, Dan. And
yeah, thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
And if you guys are still listening, thank you. This has been a little bit of a longer podcast today. So thanks for hanging with us, and hopefully there was some value in there for you. And we look forward to seeing you on Sunday. David's going to be preaching, continuing on through the Book of Jude.